This session is devoted to the geopolitical significance of the North Caucasus in the context of the war in Ukraine, of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think there are three main reasons why the North Caucasus provides a geopolitical significance to the war. The first is connected to Russia and Russia's use of the region to facilitate its invasion and its war against Ukraine. And specifically, the connection between the Sea of Azov and the Caspian Sea that runs through the North Caucasus that Russia depends on. The Volga-Don Canal is of geostrategic importance to Russia. It allows Russia to transport weapons and munitions from Iran up through the Caspian, then along through the canal, and then on to Crimea and the rest of Ukraine. It also allows the Russian Navy to reinforce its naval presence in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Of course, Turkey has closed the strait to Russian warships, so no Russian warships can enter the Black Sea if they are already out of the Black Sea. So this means Russia has to rely more on its Caspian Sea flotilla. And we know that Caspian Sea flotilla ships have transited the Volga-Don Canal from the Caspian Sea to the Sea of Azov and have participated in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So this canal is of great importance to Russia, and it runs right through the North Caucasus. So this makes the region particularly important from a military point of view. The second reason this region is important for Russia is for recruitment and for conscription into the Russian armed forces. It is thought that a disproportionate number of ethnic minority groups from the North Caucasus are fighting and dying in Ukraine with the Russian armed forces. This can have a big impact in the future regarding the societies of the North Caucasus, especially if there is a Russian military defeat inside Ukraine. You could have a disproportionate number of ethnic minority groups with combat experience that will return home to the North Caucasus and not have a job or have any future prospects. And this is probably a source of anxiety for Moscow because there is this desire for self-determination in the North Caucasus, this desire for independence and autonomy in the North Caucasus. And you could have a situation in the future where a lot of young men with combat experience return home from Ukraine with nothing available to them, and this could really speed up the process of self-determination and independence if these young men decide to take up arms against the central government in Moscow. The third reason why the North Caucasus is important in the context of Ukraine is because the region itself could very well become independent from the Russian Federation if there is a military defeat inside Ukraine of the Russian forces. I don't believe that the Cold War, I don't believe that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. I think it's still collapsing today. For the past 30 years, it's been collapsing. If you look at Russia's invasion of Georgia, if you look at the two Chechen wars, if you look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and again in 2022, The fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Karabakh, fighting between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan over border issues. Clearly, the Soviet Union is still collapsing. And I think that history has an ability to condense time. And historians, 200 years from now, when they write about the collapse of the Soviet Union, they will probably identify Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 as the most consequential and final act of this collapse. And what will emerge after this final collapse, we don't know. But it's highly likely that the nations of the North Caucasus will seek self-determination, will seek independence, and Western policymakers need to have an understanding of the region and be prepared on how to respond to these calls for self-determination in the North Caucasus in a way that's aligned with our interests and also aligned with international law and norms, respecting and recognizing the desire for self-determination. For Europe in particular, a North Caucasus that is free of the Russian Federation offers two amazing opportunities. Firstly, it could mean that Russia is no longer a Black Sea power. The independence and the establishment of a new federation, a new group of nations, new republics in the North Caucasus could deny the Russian Federation its Black Sea coastline. And what better way to make the Black Sea safe and secure than to ensure that the Russian Navy never operates there again? So this is an opportunity that we should definitely consider. Secondly, a North Caucasus that is independent of the Russian Federation could offer new, more secure trade routes. We often hear about the so-called middle corridor connecting East Asian markets with Europe, running through the South Caucasus to Azerbaijan and Georgia, and then connecting to Turkey in the west, and then the Central Asian republics in the east, and then on to Asian markets. Well, we had a North Caucasus that was independent or free of the Russian Federation, existing transit routes that are already in place would become favorable or more secure for Europe to use for trade and transit with Asia. Perhaps investors would feel confident to build additional roads and rail lines and pipelines and canals even that could better connect Asia with Europe. And this again is an opportunity that we should consider. Of course, nobody knows what's going to happen in the coming years. But in the same way that Western policymakers failed to predict the collapse, the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and early 1990s, we need to do a better job at preparing today for the possibility that the Russian Federation will collapse, and there will be the emergence of new states and new countries and new republics. The United States, in particular, needs to start working with international partners and especially its European allies to come up with a strategy, come up with a plan on how to best address this possibility. Of course, in Western capitals, this is a very sensitive subject. This doesn't have to necessarily be done in public, but at least privately, consultations need to be made. Also, U.S. policymakers need to do a better job at educating themselves about the region of the North Caucasus. We should be developing a new generation of experts on the region who can understand and speak the languages, who understand the geography and the history and the culture So in the possibility that someday there is an emergence of new states, of independence of the North Caucasus, the U.S. Will have a better ability to formulate policy on how to deal with the situation. Finally, there are a lot of people from the North Caucasus who are fighting for freedom in Ukraine. They're fighting on behalf of the Ukrainians, and many have died, many have been wounded, and I think all of us in the West, in Europe and in North America, we are very grateful, not only for the Ukrainian armed forces who are fighting for freedom and ultimately fighting for the security of the transatlantic community, but also for those foreign volunteers who have gone to Ukraine, especially from the North Caucasus, to help the Ukrainian people. And someday you may be needed back in your homes in the North Caucasus, but right now you're busy in Ukraine. So perhaps, as we say in English, this is business before pleasure, but we are all grateful that you are fighting for a free Ukraine. So, in all, thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I think there are a couple of minutes in case anyone has a question.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. First of, no, just so before, first of all, I want to say thank you very much because I know right now it's early morning in DC, and but you're very important for us. And first of all, I want to congratulate you. Russia has put you on the sanction list, right? And you be proud. You are and before, I have a question. This is question. It's my question. I think this not only my. I think not only all our conference, but I think that all the Ukrainian, probably not only Ukraine, all the world have interest that United States is interested in Russia being safe as a state, or the United States is interested in Russia changing and possibly being divided into parts. And I know you don't work at the White House, but you work on Hudson, and maybe you know interesting journals.
Right. Well, America, the U.S. policymakers traditionally like the status quo.
Yes.
They like to keep things the same if they can. And this is why we saw in the late 1980s and early 1990s the complete denial by U.S. policymakers that the Soviet Union was collapsing. And in fact, the Soviet flag came down from the Kremlin and came down from the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C. 5 days before the State Department removed the Soviet flag. So unfortunately, I don't see any ambitious or grand strategic thinking when it comes to the possibilities that could emerge if Russia is defeated in Ukraine and there's a further collapse of the Russian Federation. So that's why I'm in Washington trying to raise awareness of this issue so we can start to have a discussion.
Thank you. We have a question from the hall. Yeah, you're probably.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very focused speech. It seems that the focal point here is the North Caucasus. That's the weak side of Russia. And we're concerned, as Circassians, as Chechens, as what would be the best way really to politically promote and advocate to get policymakers, if you will, in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere to consider the strategic importance of the North Caucasus and the routes you mentioned, military and otherwise, and how do we put the Circassian and the Chechen question and the North Caucasus questions on the table of the policymakers so we can make some progress in this, because we do think that as much as it's important for us, it is going to be extremely important for the free world in the future to keep Russia out of the Black Sea. And that's one thing. And the second thing, I would have to disagree with you just a little bit, because I do believe that Zbigniew Brzezinski knew full well that the Soviet Union was going to collapse at the time before it did collapse. And he may have participated actually in the mechanism that drove it to that end. Thank you.
And your question?
The question is, what can we do as a Circassian and North Caucasus people to promote policymakers to put strategically, give us strategically the ability to form, if you will, the nation that you spoke about, and the confederation, or the unity, so we can gain the strategic depth in the Caucasus to prevent Russia from reaching the Black Sea and give the freedom that we seek and desire as Chechnya, Circassian, and other Caucasus nations.
Thank you. Thank you.
The most important thing you can do is continue having events like this, where you engage with Western policymakers, and also the more you can visit Washington, you can visit Brussels and London and Paris and the other European capitals, to meet in person with policymakers. I think that's also very good. In every meeting you go to with an American policymaker, bring a map. Bring a map of the North Caucasus that shows your vision for a free North Caucasus. Americans were terrible at geography. The world does this. So we need maps, right? So bring a map. Also, when you speak to American policymakers, I often hear the emotional reason for independence and self-determination in the North Caucasus. You hear comparisons made to 1776 and America's independence from England and America's desire for self-determination. These are important. But sometimes I think these are overstated. I think it's important to explain to American policymakers what are the direct U.S. interests for the North Caucasus being free from the Russian Federation. Talk about the possibility that Russia no longer is a Black Sea power. Talk about the possibility of new trade routes that are secure and safe, connecting east and west. Talk about the new possibilities for foreign investors in the North Caucasus if the region is stable and secure and not under the control of the Russian Federation. Americans love to hear about July 4th and our independence, but we also want to hear about direct U.S. interests in the region. So talk about these as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.